Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel. On this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the first hours of the Easter ceasefire that was announced yesterday by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. I'll remind you that yesterday during these, let's say, talks and during his meeting with the Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, the President of the Russian Federation announced the Easter ceasefire. And this announcement took, this ceasefire started at 6 p.m. of the 19th of April of 2025, and according to Putin, the ceasefire will be finished by the end of the 20th of April. So tomorrow, by the beginning of the 21st of April of 2025, the Russians will have their full military right to continue their offensive operation, to continue the special military operation. But some sources are saying that there are very high chances that this ceasefire would be extended, prolonged for another day, or probably for another 30 days. So let's wait and see, but obviously this is very important date and very important situation. At the same time, the Western media published lots of articles during the first hours of this Easter ceasefire, and every single article is about the same thing, that Putin managed to get another victory, the diplomatic victory. The real strategy behind Russia's sudden truce announcement, the CNN article. The Easter truce could make Trump pro-Russian, CNN laments. It would likely embolden Trump to frame the conflict in a pro-Moscow way at times. It could also cause complications for Ukraine when it is inevitably accused of violating what Washington might see as a goodwill gesture from Moscow. It would be a logistical nightmare for Ukrainian forces if they suddenly and immediately stopped fighting on Putin's order. Another important articles were published by different Western media. Let's discuss them also in details. First of all, we have very interesting article published by the by the Wall Street Journal. The ceasefire proposal is an easy diplomatic victory for Putin, writes the Wall Street Journal. Analysts say that brief ceasefire proposal is an easy diplomatic victory for Putin, an attempt to stop the US side from breaking off relations and a way to position himself as a leader who wants peace more than anyone else, the article says. Another important statement was made by another. The New York Times reported that Russia has shown its openness to peace talks by announcing an Easter truce. According to the New York Times, Putin ordered a halt of hostilities against Ukraine from Saturday night and Sunday, announcing an Easter truce that appears aimed at showing an impatient Trump administration that Russia is open to peace talks, the article says. You know that lots of interesting statements we got during the previous night, but probably the most interesting statements we got from Ukraine. Basically not even statements, but the absence of any statements, because Putin announced the ceasefire at 6 p.m. of, let's say, Russian-Ukrainian time, but Zelensky confirmed the ceasefire just 3 hours later. So most likely the Ukrainians were trying to find a solution how to make Zelensky as a person who win from this situation, as a person who is number one, because after Putin announced ceasefire, he was person number one, and Ukrainians were trying to find how to make Zelensky person number one, but see, they haven't managed to find a solution. And there was a very interesting situation when the, let's say, foreign ministers, like ministers from France, from, let's say, Brussels, start publishing their own statements that Zelensky should accept the ceasefire, otherwise this is going to be his big, let's say, diplomatic failure. And most likely under the pressure of the Western countries, Zelensky accepted ceasefire and made his let's say, own statement. But when talking about Ukrainians, their main statement was about they're planning to control and they're planning to check whether the Russians follow this Easter ceasefire. And Zelensky later reported that the Russians are not following ceasefire on the Kursk and on the Belgorod direction. So basically, the Russians are not following ceasefire on the territory of the Russian Federation. And according to Zelensky, there are still very heavy clashes in the vicinity of the settlements by the name of Aleshnya and in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Garnal. And by the way, during the previous 12 hours, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and basically the Russians took under control the, let's say, Sumy region in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Aleshnya. So all these territories were taken by the Russians. And I'll remind you that yesterday the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the village of Valeshnia was also taken by the Russians. So most likely today we're going to see clashes on the territory of the village of Garnal, because the Russian ceasefire doesn't include this territory. The Russian ceasefire concerns just the territory of Ukraine, nothing with this. Another important things during the previous 12 hours, we haven't received even a single Guerrilla strike. So the sky of Ukraine was completely free without any drones. But despite this situation, the Russians, before the beginning of the ceasefire, managed to improve their positions on several directions. So let's discuss these changes in details. First of all, according to different sources, the Russians, before the beginning of the Easter ceasefire, managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of the settlement Malaya Takmachka. So just small block was taken by the Russians, and the Russians, as we can see, are getting closer and closer to the former prison, which is the citadel, which is the heart of the settlement of Malaya Takmachka. As for the South Donetsk direction, during the previous, before the beginning of Russian East ceasefire, the Russians managed to take under control and to improve their positions in the vicinity of the settlement of Rozliv and to get as close as possible to the settlement of Bogatyr. The same situation took place in the Novopavlovka direction. According to different pro-Russian resources, before the beginning of the ceasefire, the Russians managed to get as close as possible to the settlement of Troitsk and Kotlarovka, basically to dig in between these two settlements and to cut this defense in two. Furthermore, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians took under control the eastern part of Uspenovka, so as you can see, the battle for the village has begun once again. And according to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Miralyubovka by taking under control additional streets. So basically, this is the situation before possible, let's say, offensive operation or fighting that most likely or not will take place on the 21st of April. When talking about the South Kliban-Byksy direction, the Russians also improved their positions in the area of the settlement Sukhaya Balka and in the vicinity of the settlement of Alexandropol. So the Russians, before the Easter ceasefire, improved their positions, but as for now, there are no more clashes. We have some changes on the ground in the Tarias direction. Today we have video that confirmed Russian control over the tree lines in the vicinity of Delievka. So right before the beginning of Easter truce, Easter ceasefire, the Russians managed to take under control these tree lines and these strongholds and to get almost the village of Delievka itself. So most likely after the end of the ceasefire, if clashes continue, we're gonna see battle for the village of Delievka and further progress of the Russians along the railways in the direction of the Konstantinovka, the city of Konstantinovka. Furthermore, as for the northern directions, we have some changes we continue receiving updates from the territory of Volchansk. The Russians continue destroying and attacking the positions of Ukraine along the Vovcha River. We've been talking a lot about this territory for the previous several days, and we expect that if ceasefire ends, if parties are not going to extend the ceasefire for another period of time, then most likely the Russians will begin their offensive in this area with the purpose to establish control over the positions along the river of Volcha. So anyway, the next 24 hours are very important. The next day is very important. And I'll remind you that during the previous day also there was a prisoner exchange process. 246 Russian soldiers returned to their homeland by Easter. Ukrainians returned the same amounts of soldiers. So it was something like Easter exchange. And according to sources, according to information, today there's going to be another prisoner exchange process. Another big amount of soldiers would be returned back to the territory of the Russian Federation and to the territory of Ukraine. And in this video, for example, we can see exactly the moment when a plane carrying Russian servicemen who were returned from captivity in the Easter landed at an airfield near Moscow. So the Russian soldiers were returning back home, and the same situation, of course, took place in Ukraine. So let's wait. Telling the truth, I hope that the ceasefire would be prolonged for another day, at least for another day. It would be better if the ceasefire would be prolonged for another month. But there are very high chances that tomorrow the special military operation can continue, because according to different, for example, NATO officers and different general and former NATO commanders, for Russia the capture of Odessa will mean the end of the war and the de facto the victory. So according to a lot of sources, the Russians still haven't managed to complete their task, their main goals of the special military operation, and we see that using the diplomatic way negotiation process, they will not get this, let's say, task as well. So only way to do this is the continuation of the special military operation. Anyway, let's wait and see. And that's it for the Easter episode. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, and happy Easter.